In the Middle Ages, when fear of serpents was as common as fear of the plague, people turned to some truly unique methods to protect themselves from these slithering threats. One of the most fascinating and mysterious practices was snake charming, a technique that involved using music to control or pacify snakes. This art was not just a form of entertainment, but also a practical skill used by those who lived in regions where venomous snakes were a constant danger. Imagine a world where every bush could hide a deadly viper, and every stream might be home to water snakes. In such an environment, being able to charm a snake meant the difference between life and death. Snake charmers were often seen as mystics or healers, blending elements of music, magic, and survival skills. Their tools were simple yet effective: a flute, a pipe, or even a reed instrument, which they would play near suspected snake dens or during encounters with wild reptiles. The practice of snake charming was rooted in ancient traditions, passed down through generations. Charms were believed to work by either hypnotizing the snake or distracting it with sound vibrations. While modern science tells us that snakes are deaf to airborne sounds, medieval people had no such knowledge. To them, the idea that music could calm a dangerous predator seemed entirely plausible, and sometimes it worked. Snake charmers were not just entertainers. They were essential figures in many communities. They would travel from village to village, offering their services to farmers, shepherds, and anyone else who needed protection from serpents. For a small fee, they would use their music to drive snakes away or even capture them alive for disposal. Some charmers claimed to have special potions or herbs that enhanced their abilities, adding an air of mystery to their craft. But snake charming wasn't without its dangers. Many charmers lost their lives to bites from venomous snakes, especially if they underestimated the creature's speed or aggression. Despite the risks, the allure of controlling a snake with nothing more than a tune was too tempting for some individuals to resist. Over time, snake charming became both a respected profession and a source of fascination for travelers and chroniclers. As we explore this forgotten method of dealing with serpents, let's delve into how music was used to tame these creatures and why it remained a vital skill in medieval times. In a world without modern medicine or pest control, medieval people relied heavily on nature to solve their problems, and one of the most persistent problems was snakes. Long before chemical repellents or snake-proof boots, villagers and farmers turned to an ancient arsenal of plants believed to keep serpents at bay. These weren't just random guesses. Many of these herbs were passed down through generations, often rooted in folklore, observation, and trial and error. One of the most widely used plants was lavender, known not only for its pleasant scent but also for its supposed ability to repel all manner of pests, including snakes. Farmers would grow lavender near their homes and barns, while others carried small sachets of dried lavender around their necks or tucked into their clothing as a personal shield against bites. Another popular choice was garlic, which held a dual purpose, warding off snakes and vampires, though medieval people probably didn't make the distinction. Garlic's strong aroma was believed to confuse or irritate a snake's senses, making it less likely to approach areas where it was planted or stored. Some families even crushed garlic cloves and smeared them around doorways and animal pens. Mint, particularly pennyroyal and wild mint, was another go-to herb. Its sharp, pungent smell made it unpleasant for many animals, including snakes, to linger nearby. It was common to see bundles of mint hung above thresholds or scattered along paths and storage rooms where food was kept. But perhaps the most intriguing plant was rue, sometimes called the herb of grace. Rue wasn't just used for snake protection. It was considered a powerful charm against evil spirits, curses, and misfortune. People planted rue around their gardens and homes, believing that its presence alone could keep both supernatural and earthly dangers away. Other plants included onions, wormwood, and elder, each with their own reputation for keeping snakes away. In some regions, people brewed potions from these plants and sprinkled the mixture around fields or livestock enclosures. While modern science might question the effectiveness of such methods, they provided psychological comfort, and sometimes that was enough to prevent panic. What's fascinating is that some of these plants do have properties that may deter reptiles. For example, certain compounds in mint and lavender can affect a snake's sensory receptors, making the area less appealing. But in the Middle Ages, belief played just as big a role as biology. So while today we might scoff at the idea of fending off snakes with a few sprigs of mint, medieval people took it seriously. To them, Every plant had a purpose, and every home needed its protective herbs. Before the age of chemical sprays and electric snake repellents, medieval people turned to one of the oldest tools in human history, fire. But they didn't just use it for warmth or cooking. Fire was also believed to be a powerful weapon against nature's more dangerous creatures, especially snakes. In many regions across Europe and the Middle East, villagers would light fires near their homes, barns, and fields to keep snakes away. The smoke, they believed, irritated the reptiles' senses and made them retreat into the wild. Some even burned specific herbs and resins known for their strong scents, like sage, myrrh, and frankincense, thinking these enhanced the protective power of the smoke. One common practice involved lighting small bonfires at night around the perimeter of a village or farm. These fires were often placed strategically near grain stores, animal pens, and water sources, places where rodents gathered and where snakes followed. People believed that not only did the smoke deter snakes, but the flickering flames also scared off other predators lurking in the dark. Another method was the use of smoke torches, carried by travelers, shepherds, and woodcutters who ventured into snake-prone areas. These torches weren't just for illumination. They served as portable protection. By waving a burning bundle of dry reeds and resin-soaked wood, a person could create enough smoke to clear a path or discourage an approaching serpent. Some communities went even further. They built smoke pits, shallow holes filled with smoldering wood and aromatic plants, around the edges of their settlements. These pits were kept burning for hours, sometimes days, creating a constant barrier between humans and the wild animals beyond. There was also a belief that certain types of wood had special powers when burned. For example, juniper and cedar were thought to carry purifying properties, making their smoke doubly effective. In some cases, people added crushed garlic or dried lavender to the fire, combining herbal and smoke-based methods into one powerful defense. While modern science tells us that smoke can indeed affect a snake's behavior, by irritating its skin and eyes, medieval people relied on more than biology. To them, fire was not just practical, it was symbolic. It represented protection, strength, and the triumph of civilization over chaos. So while today we might rely on boots and insect repellent when walking through tall grass, medieval people trusted in fire and smoke. And in many ways, their instincts were right. Few things frightened a snake more than the scent of burning earth and the heat of a roaring flame. In a world where science had yet to explain the true nature of animals, medieval people often turned to superstition and magic to protect themselves from danger. And one of the most curious beliefs was that snakes were terrified of their own reflections. Yes, you read that right. Mirrors were once thought to be powerful weapons against serpents. The idea may sound absurd today, but in the Middle Ages, it made perfect sense. Snakes were seen as mysterious, even supernatural creatures, linked to ancient myths, biblical symbolism, and dark omens. So, if they could be scared off by something as simple as a mirror, why not try it? The belief stemmed from an old folktale that claimed snakes had no soul, or worse, that they were possessed by evil spirits. Therefore, when confronted with their reflection, they would panic upon seeing what they believed to be a demon staring back at them. Some stories even claim that if a snake looked into a mirror for too long, it would die from fear or madness. This led to a surprisingly widespread practice, hanging mirrors around homes, barns, and gardens to keep snakes away. In some regions, small polished metal discs or glass shards were tied to fences, doorways, and animal pens. Wealthier households might even have owned real hand mirrors, which they strategically placed near entry points. Travelers also carried small reflective surfaces, sometimes just pieces of polished bronze or silver, tucked into their bags or attached to their belts. Shepherds and woodcutters, who spent the most time in snake-prone areas, were especially known for this. They believed that if a snake approached, all they had to do was flash the mirror, and the creature would flee in terror. One recorded account from 13th century France tells of a farmer who supposedly saved his entire livestock from a deadly serpent by holding up a mirror during an attack. According to the story, the snake froze in place, stared at its reflection, and then slithered away, never to return. Whether this is true or simply a tall tale passed down through generations, the idea stuck. Even healers and herbalists, those closest to early medicine, sometimes recommended mirrors as part of protective rituals. A common charm involved placing a mirror near a child's bed to ward off nighttime snake intrusions, while another involved burying a broken mirror under the foundation of a new house to prevent snakes from nesting nearby. Of course, we now know that snakes don't recognize their reflections. They lack the cognitive ability to understand what a mirror shows. But in the Middle Ages, belief was just as important as reality. If someone believed a mirror could save them from a deadly bite, then it did. So next time you look into a mirror, remember, in medieval times, it wasn't just for grooming. It was also your first line of defense against one of nature's most feared creatures. In a world where science had yet to explain the dangers of venom or the behavior of reptiles, medieval people turned to another powerful force: magic. And when it came to protection against snakes, one of the most common tools was the use of amulets and charms. These weren't just decorative trinkets. They were believed to hold real power, capable of shielding their wearers from deadly bites, curses, and even demonic forces. Snakes were more than just dangerous animals in medieval thought. They were symbols of evil, deception, and the devil himself. The Bible reinforced this idea, linking serpents with temptation and sin. Because of that, many people believed that snakes were not only physical threats, but spiritual ones as well. To combat both kinds of danger, people carried or wore protective charms made from a variety of materials: stone, bone, metal, or even animal teeth. Some of these charms were inscribed with prayers, runes, or alchemical symbols thought to repel evil. Others were soaked in holy water or blessed by priests before being worn around the neck or tied to clothing. One of the most popular amulets was the serpent stone, a small gemstone or piece of carved wood said to contain the spirit of a tamed snake. It was believed that if you wore this charm, the spirits of other snakes would recognize it and leave you alone. In some regions, people buried serpent stones near their homes to keep snakes away entirely. Another widely used charm was the toadstone, a mythical object believed to come from the head of a toad. Though not directly related to snakes, toadstones were thought to neutralize poisons, making them especially valuable for those who feared snake bites. Wealthy individuals sometimes set these stones into rings or pendants, believing they could detect or absorb poison upon contact. Some charms were more practical in nature. For example, horseshoes were often nailed above doorways or carried in pockets, not just for good luck, but also for protection against all manner of dangers, including snakes. This belief likely stemmed from older pagan traditions where iron was considered a sacred metal that could ward off evil spirits and creatures linked to darkness. There were also written charms, small pieces of parchment or leather inscribed with protective spells or biblical verses. One such charm read, "By the sign of the cross and the word of God, may every serpent flee before me." These were often folded and sewn into clothing or hidden inside boots for constant protection. Healers and monks sometimes created herbal amulets, combining plant-based remedies with magical elements. A bundle of rue, garlic, and sage might be wrapped in cloth and tied with red thread, a color believed to have strong protective qualities. These were commonly given to children or travelers heading into snake-prone areas. Even more extreme were animal talismans, such as the dried heart of a fox or the claw of an owl. These were believed to carry the essence of the animal's natural instincts, and since foxes were known to avoid snakes, their remains were thought to offer protection. Of course, modern science tells us that none of these objects actually prevented snake bites. But in the Middle Ages, belief was everything. If someone felt safer wearing a charm, they were less likely to panic during a snake encounter, and that alone could make a life or death difference. So while today we rely on anti-venom and medical knowledge, medieval people trusted in faith, folklore, and the mysterious power of the objects they carried. In the Middle Ages, where knowledge of snake behavior was limited and medical treatment for venomous bites nearly non-existent, people developed clever, and sometimes brutal, ways to deal with serpents. One of the most effective methods was not to fight snakes directly, but to use the environment against them. This led to the widespread use of snake pits, simple yet deadly traps that relied on gravity and fear to keep communities safe. Snake pits were usually shallow or deep holes dug into the ground near homes, barns, fields, or forest paths known for snake activity. The idea was simple: lure the snake into the pit using bait or natural movement patterns, and then let nature do the rest. Once inside, the smooth, sloped walls made it nearly impossible for the snake to climb out. These pits varied in size and design depending on the region. Some were lined with sharpened wooden stakes at the bottom, ensuring that any snake that fell and wouldn't live long enough to escape. Others had no spikes, just a deep hole that trapped the creature until someone came to finish the job with a rock or a torch. The bait used in these traps was often something that attracted rodents, like grain or food scraps, because medieval people understood that where mice went, snakes followed. By setting up a snake pit near a grain storage area or animal pen, farmers could protect their livestock without ever having to face a snake head-on. In some villages, snake pits were part of a larger defensive strategy. They were placed along the edges of settlements, hidden under leaves and twigs, creating a barrier that snakes would unknowingly cross and fall into. These pits were regularly checked by designated individuals, often older men or children too young for heavy labor. Their job was to inspect the traps each morning and either kill the captured snakes or relocate them far from human habitation. There are also more elaborate versions of this technique. In mountainous regions, people took advantage of natural rock formations, guiding snakes towards steep drops or narrow crevices where they become stuck. In forests, trenches were dug alongside well-worn animal trails, making them almost guaranteed to catch something slithering through the underbrush. Some accounts even describe the use of false dens, artificial burrows built from stone or wood that mimicked the dark, tight spaces snakes preferred. These fake dens were strategically placed and connected to underground chambers where snakes would be trapped alive. These were especially useful for those who needed live specimens for study, display, or even ritualistic purposes. Of course, not all snake pits were designed purely for protection. In some cases, they were used as tools of punishment or superstition. There are records of accused witches or criminals being thrown into snake pits as a form of execution, a cruel and terrifying fate believed to serve divine justice. Despite their simplicity, snake pits were remarkably effective. They required little maintenance, once set up, posed minimal risk to humans, and could last for years. More importantly, they gave medieval people a sense of control over one of nature's most unpredictable threats. So while today we might rely on boots, repellents, and expert removal services, medieval folk trusted in dirt, instinct, and a good old-fashioned pit in the ground. Even the most careful medieval traveler could not always avoid a snake bite. And when it happened, there was no hospital to rush to, no anti-venom. Instead, people turned to what they had, faith, folklore, and whatever strange remedies were passed down through generations. Some of these cures were bizarre. Others were downright dangerous. But all of them were believed with absolute certainty. One of the most common treatments involved applying hot oil or melted fat directly to the wound. The idea was that heat would somehow draw out the poison. In reality, this often made things worse by burning the skin and increasing the risk of infection. But in a world where pain was seen as part of the healing process, suffering was expected, even welcomed, as a sign that something was working. Another widely used method was bloodletting, a practice that dominated medieval medicine regardless of the illness. If someone was bitten by a snake, the first instinct was often to cut open the wound further, sometimes with a knife, sometimes with a heated iron, and let the blood flow. The belief was that venom mixed with the victim's blood, and by removing bad blood, the body could cleanse itself. Of course, this usually just led to weakness, dizziness, and in many cases, death from blood loss. Some healers went even further, using leeches to suck the blood from the bite site. Leeches were thought to be nature's own doctors, capable of drawing out toxins. One medical text recommended applying 70 leeches at once to severe snakebite victims. Whether this helped or simply drained the body faster is unclear, but it was considered standard treatment. Then there were the herbal poultices, made from crushed plants like garlic, onion, rue, and mint. These were applied directly to the wound, sometimes after being soaked in vinegar or wine. Some of these ingredients actually had mild antiseptic properties, which may have offered limited relief. But in most cases, the poultice served more as psychological comfort than real medicine. A particularly unusual remedy involved burning the victim's hair or clothing near the bite. It was believed that the smoke could either confuse the venom or draw it out through the skin. In some regions, people burned animal dung instead, believing that the foul smell would overpower the poison. There's also a widespread belief that magic words and prayers could neutralize venom. Priests or village healers would recite special incantations over the wound, sometimes while holding holy relics or pieces of blessed wood. Some texts instructed the healer to write biblical verses on parchment and place them over the bite. The idea was that divine power could counteract the serpent's curse. In certain parts of Europe, people tried suction methods, using their mouths to suck the venom out, a practice that rarely worked and often resulted in 2 victims instead of 1. Other versions involved using hollow reed or a small horn to create a vacuum effect over the wound. Again, this gave the illusion of action without any real medical benefit. Some cultures believed that animal sacrifice could transfer the poison away from the human. A chicken, goat, or even a dog might be placed near the wound so the venom would move into the animal instead. While completely ineffective, such rituals reinforced a sense of control in an otherwise helpless situation. The most disturbing cure, however, was the use of human urine. It was believed that fresh urine, especially from a child, had cleansing properties. Victims were encouraged to drink it or have it poured directly onto the wound. In some cases, people were told to urinate on the snake itself, thinking this would weaken its power and stop the venom from spreading. While none of these methods were scientifically sound, they provided something valuable in a time of fear: hope. And in the Middle Ages, hope was often the only medicine available. In the Middle Ages, when every tool and trick counted in the battle against danger, people didn't just rely on fire, mirrors, or herbs to protect themselves from snakes. Sometimes, they turned to nature's own hunters. Birds of prey, especially hawks, falcons, and eagles, were not only symbols of nobility and power, but also highly effective weapons against a variety of pests, including serpents. These birds had sharp eyesight, powerful talons, and an instinct for hunting that made them ideal partners in the fight against snakes. The practice of using trained birds to hunt snakes was most common among landowners, farmers, and even monks who lived near forested areas or rocky terrain where snakes were frequently encountered. While falconry was often associated with royalty and aristocracy, it wasn't always about hunting game for sport. It was also a practical means of pest control. Imagine a medieval farmer walking through his fields at dawn, a hooded hawk perched confidently on his gloved arm. The bird scans the ground below, its keen eyes spotting movement in the tall grass. Suddenly, it takes flight, diving swiftly toward the source of the motion, a coiled snake, sunning itself before beginning its hunt. With a swift strike, the bird grabs the snake mid-strike, lifting into the air before dropping it onto a rock or carrying it back to its handler. This wasn't just a dramatic display. It was a real-life strategy used by those who understood that prevention was better than cure when it came to venomous threats. Some birds were specifically trained to target snakes. Falconers would expose young birds to non-lethal snakes early in their training, teaching them to recognize the movement and shape of a serpent. Over time, the birds learned to react instantly to any slithering motion, making them valuable assets in regions where snake bites were common. Monks living in remote monasteries also used this method, with large gardens, orchards, and water sources attracting both rodents and the snakes that followed them. Having a trained bird nearby was an effective way to keep dangerous reptiles away without resorting to traps or poisons. In some cases, these birds weren't just tools. They were seen as divine protectors. Folklore in certain regions claimed that hawks and eagles were sent by God to guard humans from evil creatures, including snakes, which were often linked to the devil. Some villages even held small ceremonies before releasing trained birds into the wild during peak snake season, treating them almost like holy warriors. Of course, not everyone could afford or train a bird of prey. Falconry was expensive, requiring special equipment, knowledge, and time. But for those who could, it offered a unique and effective form of protection, one that combined human ingenuity with nature's own defenses. So while today we might call an exterminator or use chemical repellents, medieval people looked to the skies for help. And sometimes, all it took was a single dive from a well-trained bird to keep a deadly threat at bay. In a world where danger lurked not just in the wild, but also in the corners of everyday life, medieval people took great care in how they built their homes, not just for warmth and protection from invaders, but to keep out one of nature's most feared creatures, snakes. While modern homes are designed with comfort and aesthetics in mind, medieval architecture was all about survival. And when it came to snakes, every detail mattered, from the height of the floor to the materials used in construction. One of the most effective strategies was raising homes off the ground, especially in regions known for venomous snakes. In parts of Europe and the Middle East, houses were built on wooden stilts or stone foundations that kept them elevated above damp earth and tall grass, favorite hiding spots for serpents. This not only discouraged snakes from entering, but also helped protect against flooding and pests. Walls were another key element. Builders used thick stone or clay bricks, which had fewer gaps and cracks for snakes to slip through. Wooden beams were carefully sealed with mud or plaster to close any openings. Some homes even had snake-proof thresholds, metal or stone strips placed at the base of doors to block entry. Inside, raised hearths and fireplaces served a dual purpose. Not only did they provide heat, but the constant smoke and warmth made the space less appealing to cold-blooded reptiles. People believed that snakes avoided warm, dry areas, so keeping a fire burning was both practical and protective. Floors were often covered in packed dirt or stone slabs, making it harder for snakes to hide beneath. Unlike modern carpets or wooden floors, these surfaces could be inspected regularly for signs of unwanted visitors. Some homeowners went as far as placing crushed herbs like mint, garlic, or rue between floorboards, believing the scent would repel snakes naturally. In rural areas, animal pens and storage sheds were built away from living quarters, not just to reduce noise and smell, but to avoid attracting rodents, which in turn attracted snakes. These structures were often surrounded by stone walls or ditches, creating physical barriers that snakes found difficult to cross. Some villages even incorporated snake pits and traps into their architecture. Hidden trenches lined with sharpened stakes were dug around property lines, ensuring that any snake attempting to enter would either fall in or be discouraged by the sight of such defenses. Windows and ventilation holes were covered with tightly woven reed mats or cloth, preventing snakes from slipping inside while still allowing airflow. In wealthier homes, metal grates or wooden shutters were added for extra security. There were also more symbolic methods. Some builders carved protective runes or Christian symbols into door frames and cornerstones, believing these markings would ward off evil, including dangerous animals. Others buried serpent stones or animal talismans near the foundation, hoping they would scare off real snakes through magical influence. But perhaps the most fascinating example of medieval defensive architecture comes from certain monasteries and castles, where entire sections of buildings were designed to be snake-free zones. Monks in some religious communities built elevated walkways and enclosed gardens, using high stone walls and controlled access points to ensure no reptiles could enter sacred spaces. Even city dwellers found ways to adapt. In densely populated towns, multi-story homes were common, and upper floors were considered safer from snakes due to their distance from the ground. Some families slept on raised platforms or wooden bunks, further reducing the chance of an unwelcome visitor crawling into bed with them. While none of these architectural choices were foolproof, they gave medieval people a sense of control over an unpredictable threat. And in a time when medicine couldn't cure a bite and fear ran deep, that sense of safety was priceless. In a world where science had not yet explained the mysteries of venom, disease, or animal behavior, medieval people turned to faith as their greatest shield against danger. And nowhere was this more evident than in their battle with snakes. Snakes were not just feared for their bites. They were seen as symbols of evil, deception, and the devil himself. The Bible reinforced this belief, linking serpents with temptation, sin, and death. Because of that, many medieval communities believed that protection from snakes required divine intervention. Churches, monasteries, and even individual homes often became centers of ritual protection. Priests performed special blessings over fields, barns, and doorways, using holy water and prayers to cleanse areas of serpent threats. Some rituals involved placing blessed relics or crucifixes near snake-prone locations, believing that the presence of sacred objects would keep reptiles away. One of the most common practices was the use of written charms, small pieces of parchment inscribed with prayers or biblical verses. These were folded tightly and sewn into clothing or carried in pockets as portable protection. One such charm read, "By the sign of the cross and the word of God, may every serpent flee before me." In some regions, villagers gathered at sunrise to perform communal exorcisms, dramatic ceremonies meant to drive out evil forces, including snakes. A priest would lead a procession through the fields, chanting Latin hymns while sprinkling holy water on the ground. It was believed that these rituals purified the land and made it inhospitable to dangerous creatures. Another widespread belief was that serpent stones, small carved talismans blessed by priests, held divine power over real snakes. These stones were often buried near homes or worn around the neck like amulets. Some people even placed them inside chicken coops or grain stores to protect livestock and food supplies. Monks living in remote monasteries also developed unique methods of protection. They would recite specific psalms known for their protective qualities, particularly Psalm 91, which reads, "You will not fear the terror of night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in darkness." This passage was interpreted as a promise of divine safety from all manner of threats, including deadly animals. There are also protective prayers written specifically for snakebite victims. These were whispered over the wound or spoken aloud while holding a piece of consecrated bread. In some cases, patients were instructed to drink water that had been prayed over, believing it could neutralize the poison. One particularly unusual ritual involved placing a live snake inside a church during certain religious festivals. The idea was that if the snake remained calm and did not strike, it was proof that the building was truly holy and protected by God. If the snake became aggressive, it was seen as a sign that evil forces were still present, and further cleansing was needed. Even the act of making the sign of the cross was considered a defense mechanism. Travelers heading into snake-prone areas would mark themselves with the cross before setting off, believing that this simple gesture could ward off attacks. Some communities went so far as to hold annual processions dedicated to Saint Cyprian, a Christian martyr who was said to have defeated a monstrous serpent in single combat. During these events, statues of saints were paraded through villages, and children were taught to pray for protection using specific invocations. While none of these rituals had any scientific basis, they provided something powerful, a sense of control in an unpredictable world. Belief in divine protection gave people courage when facing dangers they couldn't understand or fight directly. So while today we rely on medical knowledge and anti-venom, medieval people trusted in prayer, relics, and the power of faith. And for many, that faith was enough to face one of nature's most feared creatures head-on. So here we are at the end of our journey through the forgotten and often horrifying ways medieval people fought off snakes. From music that supposedly charmed serpents, to herbs that masked their scent, from fire and mirrors to charms and birds of prey, these methods were as creative as they were desperate. But behind every strange remedy was a simple truth. In a world without modern medicine, science, or pest control, people relied on what they had: belief, observation, and sheer willpower. Whether it worked or not didn't always matter. What mattered was feeling like they had some control over a threat that could strike without warning. Today, we look back at these practices with fascination, sometimes even amusement. We know now that mirrors don't scare snakes, that bloodletting doesn't cure bites, and that throwing holy water at a serpent won't make it vanish. But we also have something medieval people lacked: knowledge, medicine, and protection. Still, there's value in understanding how past generations faced danger. It reminds us how far we've come and how much we take for granted. The next time you see a snake warning sign or hear about someone surviving a bite thanks to anti-venom, remember the centuries of trial, error, and superstition that led us to this point. The Middle Ages may be long gone, but its stories live on, filled with mystery, danger, and a relentless human spirit trying to survive against all odds. If you enjoyed this deep dive into medieval survival tactics, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another video exploring the hidden truths of history. And if you're curious to learn more about how people lived and died in the past, give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who thinks modern life is too tough. Because trust me, compared to the Middle Ages, we've got it easy.